Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about the traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. This podcast is created by Antecedent Ventures, an enterprise-focused seed-stage venture firm in New York City. You can find us at www.antecedent.vc. I'm your host, Steve BERG. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Andrew Zolli is the author of Resilience: Why Things Bounce Back. His thoughts and ideas regularly appear in dozens of leading publications and media outlets. Now, normally, I would list off a bunch of jobs that Andrew currently has. But in this case, before the interview, he explained it, and I thought he did a pretty good job. So I'm going to let him do it for himself.
What I do today is I oversee the global impact team at a breakthrough geospatial organization called Planet, which is, if you go to online at planet.com, Planet was started by three NASA scientists and engineers, attracted really significant amounts of investment from, the preeminent venture capital of Silicon Valley, some of the preeminent venture capital of Silicon Valley, as well as a bunch of international development and triple bottom line social impact investors. It's a very unusual mix. And what Planet has done is deployed the largest constellation of Earth-observing satellites in history in a giant ring around the Earth. These satellites, which are each about the size of a loaf of bread, collectively orbit the Earth basically from the North Pole over the equator down to the South Pole. And they spin between the Earth and the sun and then up over the dark side of the Earth. And as they do that every day, they image the entire terrestrial surface of the planet in high resolution. All that data is downloaded to a series of ground stations in the cloud, and then they're uploaded where they enable all kinds of organizations and institutions to do breakthrough things by being able to monitor anywhere on the Earth on a daily basis. So for things like disaster response and agriculture, for monitoring forests, for Planet's technology can see every field, every forest, every city, everywhere, every day. We can watch the pulsing of urban infrastructure and the growth of human habitats. We can watch the shrinkage of the forests. And being able to do that allows us to build technologies that allow us to both see and act on those changes. And the reason I got engaged with it is because it's really building planetary scale resilient systems. That was why it was so attractive to me, and in fact, why we started talking. I've been there since 2013.
In addition, Andrew has served as a fellow of the National Geographic Society. All of this I find very interesting. Welcome, Andrew. Thanks for taking the time. As I look over your book and your interviews and op-eds and everything that you've written and talked about, it all seems to me to be in the context of systems, ecosystems, economies, cultures, communities, enterprises, organizations, what you call the mother of all interconnected systems, which is globalization. If we use that as an underpinning, let's just start out by defining resilience, would you?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's great to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me. When we think about resilience, we can think about it from many different perspectives. And in that spirit, let me offer you two different definitions, and they appeal to different aspects of the way that human beings think. So one way to think about resilience is the ability to absorb shocks and disruptions and volatility and change while maintaining our core purpose with integrity. That definition appeals to our innate interest and sense in maintaining and preserving that which is core. And there are many people who are sort of oriented that way. A different definition is the ability to persist, recover, or even thrive amid disruption. And that persist, recover, and thrive function says less that we're going to do the same thing from day to day and more that we're going to flourish under a wide variety of circumstances, even if we don't know precisely what those circumstances are going to be.
So what you're talking about in the second part of the definition is essentially adaptation, right? Which is, I mean, to me, kind of an obvious, vertical of resilience.
Yeah, I think that's right. As an entrepreneur or as an innovator of any kind, you really have to do both things. You have to hold on to preserve some instinctual vision about what's possible. And you may have to climb over many hills and valleys to ultimately achieve that vision. And so you need a combination of being fixed and designing systems that can keep you fixed regardless of the changing circumstances. You also need to make sure that those changing circumstances don't swamp you and don't destroy you. So that agility is a really fundamental core function. And if you look at the world we live in today, you can see why both of those things are so important. We live in a world in which there's lots of what we might think of as sort of exogenous volatility. So at a planetary scale, there's a changing climate, there's changing ecological conditions. We live in an increasingly crowded human crowded planet. So we live in an era that geologists and planetary scientists refer to as the Anthropocene, in which human beings no longer just influence the planet, we're the dominant force of change upon the Earth, and we're changing the basic biogeochemical processes on which all life depends. And those functions, in turn, shape the kinds of interconnected global system of trade and exchange and the flow of materials, the exchange of ideas, and those in turn shape the kind of conceptual and market system in which people want to innovate and make change and create wealth and create value. So the challenge for the moment we live in now is that system is under very significant pressure. And change and volatility in one domain of human life can very rapidly be transmitted to other parts of the system, far flung to other places and in other domains. That's the sort of, we live not just with the butterfly effect, but with now swarms of butterflies all over the world flapping their wings and creating a world of intrinsic surprise and intrinsic volatility. So whether those are the kinds of changes that come from disruptions in the negative sense, or whether they come from disruptions in the positive sense, the world is changing much faster. So our need to be resilient and agile goes up commensurately.
So that answer was so amazingly precise. I don't know if you remember this, but you wrote a New York Times op-ed piece in which you said, in today's world, a perfect stasis under glass equilibrium is not achievable. Resilience takes this as a given. It doesn't assume a single fixed future. It assumes that we don't know exactly how things will unfold, that we're going to be surprised, and that we'll make mistakes along the way. I think that you absolutely just summarized that, what you wrote. And the most important part to me is it assumes that we don't know how things will unfold, and we're going to make mistakes along the way.
That's right. Most of the purpose of our forecasts used to be there are lots of different. Let me back up and ask you a question. How is the world changing? So, and how does it change? Now, the answer to that question has been the subject of countless political science PhDs. Countless philosophers and historians have looked at cyclical forms of change. They've looked at, theories of change that are rooted in the rise of certain individuals and sort of great individuals that drive and reshape systems. It seems to me that one of the things that defined change in the middle of the 20th century up until the end of the 20th century, especially in the West and in the US, is a kind of punctuated equilibrium. We had periods of time when things were relatively stable, then periods of time of very, very rapid progressive change, and then a kind of reintegration towards stability. But those windows of stability have gotten shorter and shorter and shorter, and the periods of punctuation between them have become more frequent and more intense. And so as a really simple example, my father worked for 40 years for the same company. He worked for the electric company in Massachusetts. And in his era, it was possible to conceive of working for the same company for 4 decades. And there was a mutual social contract between employers and employees that was rooted in the idea that this was a relatively stable place where you traded rock star status for rock solid stability. And it attracted the kinds of people who believed in that social contract, which went both ways. Can you imagine an employer signing people up to 40-year contracts today? I mean, that very idea has gone by the wayside just because the world has become so volatile that it's impossible to plan through those periods of punctuated equilibrium. So as a consequence, as a society, as individuals, as communities, as entrepreneurs, and as organizations, what gets tossed overboard is a firm commitment to plan. This is our plan, and this is what we're doing. The planning comes under more pressure, and what comes to the fore, I should say, is agility, the ability to adapt, in which you might have a North Star vision of where you'd like to go, but you eschew a fixed plan for getting there, and you engage in lots of agile behaviors that you think are going to lead you in that direction.
So it sounds like in saying that our ability to plan is slowly going away. To me, that sounds like what you're saying is resilience is so much more important now than it ever used to be. Well,
I think it's certainly more important now. It's important that it's important that we not only are more agile because and more resilient because it allows us to adjust in real time to changing circumstances, but also because it's an important hedge against being knocked backwards and seeing what progress we've made be completely eliminated, no matter what domain we're talking about in human affairs.
Right. So the rate of change has increased, so the required agility is also increased.
Yes, that's right. And so what you want is, there are many ways to deal with these circumstances, but certainly the days of being able to establish, kind of permanent structural legacies and where scale necessarily helps you. I mean, so for instance, one of the ways in which organizations used to hedge against the future is they just get big. It's hard to be at risk if you're kind of a predator scale organism in an ecosystem. But what we found is that in many instances, scale is not your friend, it's your enemy. Being too big and too slow means that you're just painting a giant target on your back.
Yeah, the conglomerate doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, we're living in an era today in which GE is historically one of the great conglomerates of the age, for instance, is slowly taking itself apart.
Yep.
And we see plenty of those examples.
So speaking of some of those examples, there's a handful of stories that I think are instructional And I'm going to have you tell the stories first and then maybe dig into them as we get into the weeds a little bit more on resilience after that. Story number one, this is a story in the book about the pinnatus batfish, which were, quote unquote, the keepers of coral reefs.
In looking at the strategies for how coral reefs can survive, there's a group of researchers in Australia, and those Australians noticed something really interesting in this tipping between the kind of normal state of affairs, when corals are beautiful and robust and richly interconnected, and when they tip into becoming algae dominated. And they noticed the change of this behavior of this batfish, which is what you asked about. Under normal circumstances, the batfish was only ever studied under normal circumstances, and it was always observed to eat the corals themselves. It sort of had a little beak, and it would nibble at the corals. These are like kind of like, the best way to describe them is sort of the lawnmowers of the reef. They would tidy things and keep them clean. What was interesting was that a group of researchers began to study, because we're all studying these bleaching events and these changes in reef structure that can lead to their death. A group of researchers then began to look at what was happening when the reef would shift into this algae-dominated death spiral. And one of the things they discovered was that these little pinnate batfish changed their behavior in a way that wasn't documented anywhere in the literature. They stopped eating the corals and they started eating the algae, the invasive algae, just at the point when the system was on the threshold of tipping from one circumstance into another. They sort of nudged an unhealthy system that was on the verge of collapsing back into a healthy state. The idea here is to understand that the reef as a whole, including the batfish, actually carries that latent behavior in the DNA of the batfish as a way of adjusting to a potential tipping point.
Kind of keeping equilibrium.
Yes, exactly. Keeping the system not static, but floating around an equilibrium point so that it doesn't tip badly into a situation from which it may not be able to recover. And that idea that there are kind of latent strategies for that we carry with us, and they're expensive. That's the important thing to understand, is that resilience isn't free. It requires us to carry strategies that are maybe sometimes suboptimal. For example, if you're carrying around an umbrella in the sunshine, you got one less free hand that you can use. There's a cost to carrying the umbrella, not to mention the cost of the umbrella itself. But so if you're walking around with an umbrella in the sunshine, you also might incur the ridicule of your friends, right, until it starts raining, at which point you have a latent strategy and your behavior is less disrupted than theirs. And what we find in resilient systems is that in ways large and small, they carry, even during the good times, strategies for how to deal with things when they are headed toward, when they're headed off the rails.
It's like a little tax that pays for the opportunity to be ready when circumstances change. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And in fact, actually, if you look at one of the challenges in human systems, in organizations, in cultures, societies, families, and even in our lives as individuals, we have one of the biggest challenges with us is memory. How do we carry the memory forward? And a great example of this is if you look at what happened in the Great Depression. We had a situation in which we had the conflation of investment banking and personal savings banking. And in the wake of the Great Depression, after we had to reboot essentially the capitalist system, we passed a law, and that law protected, it separated the investment banking and individual lending.
Glass-Steagall.
It's called the Glass-Steagall Act. That's right. It separated those two activities. And it stayed in effect until the Clinton administration, when in the second half of the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton's under significant lobbying pressure from the banks, did away with it, saying, okay, we're in a new era. We don't need those protections. We don't need those kinds of things. That's anachronistic. And it was precisely 10 years after he signed that act, allowing for the reintegration of investment banking and personal savings, that we got the financial crisis in 2008. So the question is, why could Clinton sign such an act? And the reason was that all the people who had been major stakeholders in signing the original Glass-Steagall Act were dead or elderly. They were out of the picture. We had lost the cultural memory of what the Great Depression looked like, or we never would have entertained. It would have been politically impossible to get rid of Glass-Steagall in 1950 because everybody who'd lived through the Great Depression was still around and voting. But it was easy to do it in the 1990s because those people were in their 80s, and or most of the people who had been around in that time had passed on. So the ability to preserve the memory of past events is a big part of our resilience as well.
So I'm glad that you started to tell that story, because I know that story, and that was one of the ones I was going to ask you to tell anyway, is tied to a story about a tsunami that happened in Moriyama, Japan 1,000 years ago.
That's right. That's right. Well, actually, the interesting thing is that, some of your listeners will remember that it wasn't that long ago. It was about 7 years ago that we had a mega tsunami that hit in Japan. We think of it as
Fukushima.
Fukushima. It's a compound tragedy that was a giant tsunami that led to not only a major natural disaster, but a major electrical infrastructure and nuclear disaster. Because we'd put the Japanese had put a major nuclear power plant right on the coast. So what's interesting is that we described that event as a kind of once-in-a-millennium event. And it was a once-in-a-millennium event. A millennium prior, there had been another event. And there had been another once-in-a-millennium major mega tsunami. And during that period, in a little island in Japan, there was this inbound tsunami wave. And people know, if you live in a coastal community, what a tsunami looks like, because the first thing that happens is the water goes way out. And, given that what comes out must come back, people understood that they were in for a really major wave. So they scrambled to high ground. But because of the geometry of the hills in that area, people scrambled to what was apparently high ground. It turned out not to be safe and were wiped away. And so the residents of this one village in Murahama erected a religious shrine. That shrine was a shrine to the victims of the mega tsunami 1,000 years ago, but it also served as a high water warning that said this place looks safe, but it isn't. And in 2011, the presence of that shrine saved people's lives because it guided behavior a millennia. It was a message from those people to people ultimately 1,000 years later about how to change their behavior when one of these events occurred. Now, how do you transmit a message 1,000 years into the future is an interesting engineering question, but it's much more interesting as a social science question. How do you get people to pay attention to it? So the fact they'd wrapped it into the framework of a shrine to be preserved and continued, that is to say, they'd embedded the message in a religious structure, gave it a very good chance for continuing over what were 10 centuries.
I mean, to me, I think the interesting thing is the Japanese culture valued that institutional memory or cultural memory. The United States, in this particular instance, did not, right? And as a result of that, essentially allowed history to repeat itself.
That's true. But before we decide in any conversation that, the answer is to always remember the past, it's important to know that sometimes the situation is just the reverse. That is to say, sometimes the path to resilience is in forgetting the past and letting new realities come forth. And the challenge is to know when. That's why resilience, for all of the for all of the attention this idea gets, it's still largely artisanal. It's an art form as much as a science. So we know a little bit like what the keys on the resilience keyboard are, but the specific melody that everybody needs to play to get there is distinctive. And so, for example, also in Japan, one of the groups I spent some time with was the world's oldest company, which was a construction company called Kongogumi, which went bankrupt just a few years before the mega tsunami. The interesting thing about it was that this is a temple building organization that had gotten started 1,400 years ago and continued through 38 generations, and owed its longevity to its flexibility. They always hired the eldest son to run the temple building organization, and they defined eldest son very flexibly. Sometimes the eldest son was the grandmother of the oldest son. Sort of became an honorific term so that they could pull talent in. But the important thing about it was that they got too attached to very specific forms of practices, and eventually they went out of business because the company had an entrenched culture that had difficulty adapting to emerging circumstances. So again, sometimes resilience is found in the things we remember, and sometimes it's found in the things we choose to forget.
Interesting. Too much adherence to repetition and what has worked before is going to continue to work always.
That's right. That's right. A highly dynamic culture may choose to do the same thing over and over and over again. It's the fact of having those agile, dynamic cycles in the organization so that things become continuously reassessed. It isn't about always changing what you're doing, I guess is what I'm saying. It's highly circumstantial.
Okay, that sounds good. Let's take this as a backdrop and talk about resilience with regard to people, individuals. I did a podcast episode a few months ago about willpower. And one of the things that the guest, in this case, his name is John Tierney, said was that there's a high correlation between people with strong willpower and people from religious backgrounds. And his argument was that the particular disciplines that organized religion fosters are transferable into how we live our lives. So I noticed that you were saying something similar about spirituality being typically more resilient, although I thought it was related more to a set of beliefs. Any chance you could unpack this a little bit for us?
Sure. Well, as I was saying a moment ago, there aren't a single set of factors that confer resilience on individuals or organizations, but there are a series of correlates of resilience. So the things that are correlated with building resilience at the individual level are many. The size of your social network affects your level of resilience. Very importantly, not just the number of people you know, but the quality of those relationships matters a ton. The degree to which you have people in your life who you deeply trust, who you deeply love, who express that love to you and to whom you reciprocate, the most intimate and close relationships you have really influence your resilience. Your genes, your physical health, your brain health, all of those things confer resilience upon us. The challenge is that for most of us, many of those factors are not things that are wholly within our control. We can and should go to the gym, and we should take care of our minds and bodies. But there are many factors in our genes and in our life experience that we really fundamentally can't control. Sometimes life just happens to us. There are, however, some things that we can do that can shape our resilience. And in order to talk about them, I tell you just a couple. I have to set up a couple of ideas. So the first thing is that a significant portion of the way in which you respond to life's vicissitudes, to the volatility and disruption of lived experience, comes in your emotional response. And it also comes in your beliefs. So, for example, if you believe that the world is a capricious and random place where bad things happen and there's no control you have upon it, there's no control that you can exert over your life experience, you don't think you don't see yourself as having a great deal of agency, then you're much more likely to interpret the bad stuff that happens in life, the natural shocks and disruptions and disappointments of life, from a place of bitterness. And yet, if you believe that the world is a meaningful place where failures and challenges are placed in your path to teach you, where you believe that you have agency and that you believe that the cumulative experience of these shocks and disruptions forms a narrative that's meaningful, and you can place yourself within a kind of meaningful cosmology of the world, no matter what you believe, no matter what particular faith system you either believe, adhere, or invent, any of those things, you're much more likely to interpret the difficult times in life in a way that's instructive to you. And that's why a robust finding of the social sciences is that people who have one of those personal cosmologies, those personal metaphysical worldviews, tend to be slightly more resilient than average. Not because believing in God or believing in a particular faith system it makes you resilient, but rather because the things you have to believe in those faith systems are also the kinds of things you have to believe to make they also confer some resilience advantage upon you, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, but even then, most of us have a very difficult time changing what we fundamentally believe about the world. Your outlook on life is one of the most challenging things to shift intentionally about yourself.
There's another piece of this which you call habits of mind. This is very interesting because I think it is tantamount to a personal resilience toolbox. Explain habits of mind, and if you would touch on both the emotional impact and the physiological impact, that'd be great.
So this research begins with a constellation of neuroscientists and social scientists, psychologists and cognitive scientists, led by a researcher at the University of Wisconsin called Richard Davidson, who began looking at how some of the very best people in the world at controlling their mental and emotional state, how do they do it? So he began by studying the brains of actively meditating Buddhist monks. Now, before I tell you about what he found, let me just give you a basic little narrative to explain this idea. I want you to imagine that you're driving down the highway and someone cuts you off, right? How many people here would lean on the horn? How many people listening would lean on the horn or raise a middle finger or shout, right? Work themselves up in some way at the person who engaged in this, let's call it what it is, kind of dickish behavior that this person engaged in. Now, we can all relate to that story and to the temptation to act that way because it comports with the way we normally experience our emotional lives, which is we're going along, minding our own business, something happens, and in response to that something, our emotions are part of our response. So we are justifiably angry, and we express that anger, and it's all part of one reactive experience. Well, this group of researchers identified that when working with these contemplative practitioners, a slightly different way of thinking about our emotions. So instead of thinking about our emotions as just part of our reactive core, think about it as if you have a kind of reserve, like a tank of unspecified emotional response, like emotiononium. And at a certain point, when the person cuts you off on the highway, instead of reacting, you pause and you decide how seriously you're going to react to this. You sort of decide, this is how much I have in my tank. This is how much I'm going to invest in my response. By putting an extra step into the experience, We can be judicious about how much emotional reaction we invest into this. And as a consequence, we can be sure that our emotional tank never runs dry. And it's because when our tank runs dry, that's the point where we do real damage to ourselves. So by taking this extra beat of mindful behavior, and what he found was that even further, that these contemplative practitioners could not only decide how much emotional investment to have in a particular experience, but precisely which emotional reaction to have. They could basically steer their emotions the way they steered their cognition. And that's one protective path, and it's actually why you're seeing contemplative practices, mindfulness practices, being used with people who are in high-stress positions, whether they're emergency room physicians or aid workers, or people, journalists, and people in other high-stress circumstances like military, front line, active duty military, or even people who are in the child welfare system. So across the board, having better emotional control matters a ton.
So there's a couple of things in there that I wanted to bring up. One of them, so I'm going to stick with meditation for a second. There's actually a physiological impact on cellular inflammation associated or value associated with mindfulness.
Yes, that's right. So there's a proxy in your body for cellular inflammation. And we should, for your listeners, say cellular inflammation, inflammatory illnesses are not, it's not like retaining water. It's not like plumping. At the cellular level, your inflammatory response is part of your immunological response to illness. And when it goes haywire, it can do real damage to you. And there is a connection between excesses of inflammatory response at the kind of cellular level and autoimmune disorders, cancer, a number of other things. And in some of the research, what we see defined very clearly is people come in, they learn the tools of psychological self-regulation, and in the process, they avoid the physiological excesses of extensive inflammation and related illnesses. So people's the measurement of this specific chemical in the body comes down, and as a consequence, your long-term health prospects go up.
Yeah. So in fact, I mean that a lot of people think that inflammation is the biggest kind of culprit that causes aging. So I mean, in my mind, I think what you're saying is meditation, mindfulness can actually kind of help you stay resilient, stay young.
That's true. It also has another factor. It does something else to us, and that is that in order to understand that, I have to just share with you one other little mental model. I want your listeners to think about what the relationship is between the cumulative amount of stressors in your life and your level of resilience, psychosocial resilience in this case. The relationship between them is sort of surprising in that it forms an upside down U shape, which is to say that people who have not experienced a great deal of stress and shocks and disruptions are actually pretty irresilient. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason for that is that shocks and disruptions, in some modest amount, actually teach you how to deal with them. So there's something called the stress inoculation effect. Small amounts of stressors in your life actually teach you how to deal with stress. And so they're actually beneficial for you. And then there's a kind of warm zone in the middle where getting just the right amount of challenge is helpful. And then you start to see a point of diminishing and literally, sort of goes off a cliff where you get overstressed and you're in a situation in which your resilience is impaired once again. And this is interesting because if you think about some of the people who are the most exposed to stress and disruption, people who come from persistent and chronic poverty, people who come from environments in which they are routinely, almost intergenerationally stressed, they are irresilient in some of the same ways that people who are under exposed to stress, people who are chronically overprotected, the wealthiest, the most cosseted people in our lives, are often irresilient in the same ways.
Interesting.
They have the
like a bell curve. It's like a bell curve, right?
It's not quite a bell curve. It's more of a U curve. It doesn't flatten out at the bottoms quite as much, but the basic concept is the same. And the thing that's important is that, like many things in life, there's a kind of warm zone in the middle where you want enough meaningful challenge that you can integrate the successful transcendence of those challenges into a larger life narrative of moving forward and dealing with things and progressing and learning and growing without falling off the cliff.
So there's a transition right here. That answer is a really good transition. I have a son who's 8, and I think you have a son or daughter who's just about the same age. Mm-hmm. And I think we're kind of touching on it, but maybe a little more color. The notion of modest failure, right? The presence of some failure is actually good, right? The impact of sheltering or overpraising is actually kind of keeping them soft.
Yes, that's exactly right. We I think in our society today, there is, you see a systemic issue that leads to individual behaviors. And the systemic issue is a kind of fear that has shaped the contemporary world. I mean, I'm in my late 40s now. And as a child, I went outside at 8 o'clock in the morning. Nobody had any idea where I was until the sun went down. I was wandering the woods and I was maybe a year or two older than the children that I have now. Today we have situations where parents are literally arrested for allowing 10-year-old kids to wait at the bus stop or to find their way to school on public transportation because there's a perception that they might be neglecting their kids.
So how do you deal with that, right? How do you allow that modest failure to happen?
Well, I think the reality is that you have to create structures where meaningful risks can be taken that are calibrated accordingly. And so, for instance, some of that is about exposing children to the idea that there's skills they simply will not succeed at, avoiding overpraise, avoiding always praising the intent and the effort, not the accomplishment. So that is to say, if someone wins, but they didn't work for the win, not praising the win. Yeah. And being careful about how we calibrate opportunities for our children to take meaningful steps away from us, and also realizing that we are not here to wholly inoculate our kids from risk or wholly protect them from risk. The goal is to calibrate them to ever widening circles in which they will take greater and greater risks, and that is a real challenge for adults in this era. In part because we are more informed than our parents were. The movie that runs inside our eyelids of the number of things that could happen to our precious kids is far more specific, I think, and more cinematographic than the movie our parents got to play in their heads.
So the answer that you gave with regard to praising the effort, that might be a good transition to talk about resilient enterprises and organizations, because I would imagine that leaders of organizations should kind of enact that behavior as well.
Yeah, I think that's right, actually. So, what's really interesting about this is you can see some of these behaviors. So you're absolutely right. Organizations need to be careful not simply to praise the most basic kinds of metrics of success, like it might be revenue generated or the like, or customer acquired. Organizations that are a little less exposed to kind of one dimension of thinking have embraced this style of really looking at what you might call kind of praising failures in practice. And a great example of this is at Google X, the X Labs, which is Alphabet's spin-off to do very advanced research and development work, gives bonuses to teams that fail.
They fail quickly.
As long as they fail quickly.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And as long as they fail meaningfully.
The other thing that occurred to me is when you were giving the definition of resilience, you talked about core purpose and adaptation. I've also heard you say that a resilient organization needs to be diverse at its edges, but it's simple at its core.
Yes, I think that's right. And what you're trying to do, what I was trying to say with that metaphor is that whether you have whether they're defined as key behaviors or key values or a key mission or vision, there have to be things that bind the organization together, and they have to be understandable by everybody. So what you want is an organization that is strategically tight. That is, by which I mean, from a values perspective, we know what we value, we know what we're here to do in the largest scheme of things, but we are tactically loose. So you want tight strategies and loose tactics, or a simple core and a diverse edge. They both mean the same thing. And that is that you want to tolerate lots of experimentation, lots of creativity, lots of innovation at the edges of an organization, while making sure that everybody holds that common purpose in mind, and that purpose defined as one that transcends the particular circumstances you're in. In order to do that, you have to deal with the number one currency of resilience in organizations, by far the most important thing that gets you all of that. Or I should say, it doesn't ensure you'll have all of those things, but without it, there's no chance of it. And that is trust. In an organization, especially agile organizations, people are going to be trying things that may or may not comply with every diktat of a kind of central operating committee. The important thing is for the organization to develop a trust of itself, and a self-confidence that in its own individuals to lead, especially in ambiguous circumstances, because it may be too difficult in those circumstances to perfectly communicate or to perfectly coordinate. And many organizations today, they never become resilient because they create a culture in which people don't feel. You hear when people talk about empowerment, when they talk about do you believe in us? All of that language is really a proxy for trust, which is, do you trust me to make wise decisions, inspired by and in agreement with the things that you and I hold as important, and in understanding what the inflexible rules are. Do you trust me outside of that umbrella of the things with which we must comply to behave as I see fit? And organizations that are high trust have a strong correlation with high degrees of creativity and high degrees of success.
That's interesting.
And therefore high degrees of resilience. Yeah.
I thought you would, I mean, trust seems like the right answer. I thought you were going to say it was cognitive diversity, but trust I think is better. Okay. That's the last prepared question I had. I always wind up with a couple of, quick follow-ons. I don't think we omitted anything in particular that we didn't cover that I should have.
No,
okay.
This was great. I really enjoyed this, and I'm happy to share more. this is a conversation that continuously unfolds. And I will say one thing about resilience, both as a writing project, as a thinking project. I've learned much more about it since I wrote that book. Because whenever you write a book like this, you're basically inviting 1,000 conversations into your life about that subject. Yeah. And so, our understanding of it as a species, our understanding of it as entrepreneurs, as organizations is continuously unfolding. And I'm happy to share a little bit of what we learned with your listeners.
So being that is the case, I'm sure you would want people to follow you someplace or be able to reach you someplace. Where might that best someplace be?
Sure. You can reach me. You can follow me on Twitter at Andrew_Zolli, which is Zolli. I'd encourage your listeners to check out Planet at Planet, or go to andrewzolli.com.
You also have mentioned in the past, I'm going to throw a couple in here, the Stockholm Resilience Center, the Resilience Alliance, and I also encourage people to check out Doors of Perception. All right, that is the end. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you so much. It was great.
This has been Intangibles, a podcast created by Antecedent Ventures. Find out more at www.antecedent.vc. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd also like to thank Ben Glowy, who has been instrumental in helping me record and produce this season. I couldn't have done it without him. Find him on Twitter at visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode, and if you like this one, leave us a favorable review. I'm your host, Steve Berg.